The machine had done it 300 times before. It would do it again. That was the thing about the hegemony's designation system. It didn't feel anything about the work. It wasn't built to. It was built to be fast, clean, and precise. The way a blade is built to be fast, clean, and precise. You didn't ask a blade if it felt bad about cutting. You just made sure it was sharp. Fleet Designate Urkan sat in the command chamber of the Time's Eternal Meridian Times and looked at the file the same way he'd looked at 300 files before it. A blue-green world. Mostly water. One moon. A single star, average size, average heat, nothing special. The creatures on it were soft, bipedal. They had figured out basic space travel and were very proud of themselves about it. The way children are proud when they first learn to write their names. He read the designation file in 4 minutes, signed it in the 5th. The signal was ready. 12 seconds of compressed light, encoded in the hegemony's standard absorption format, bounced off 3 relay buoys in the outer system, and fired into the dark. The buoys would make sure it arrived everywhere at once, the target world, every member species of the Galactic Compact, every registered diplomatic post in the known galaxy. A courtesy. That was how Urkan thought of it. A kindness, even. Giving the target world time to prepare, time to choose the right path, the smart path, the path that 300 worlds before them had chosen when the numbers became obvious. Compliance. Survival. The sensible thing. Target designation, Earth, Sol System, Sector 7, Yellow, Class 3. Organic world absorption sequence. Initiated. Projected compliance window. 14 cycles. He pressed the seal. The signal fired. Urkan was already reading the next file before the light had cleared the system. He had 17 other matters waiting. Trade disputes. A border complaint from the Yeravaxi that needed a firm response. A resupply request from the 3rd Absorption Fleet that was taking longer than scheduled on world number 298. The small machinery of Empire. Earth was an entry in a ledger. Nothing more. He did not look up. The archivist had been in the same chamber for 4,000 years. Not continuously he slept. He ate. He moved through the building in the slow way that very old things move, like stone that has learned to walk. But the chamber was always his. The other archivists used the outer offices. This one, the deepest room in the Compact's Hall of Records, with its curved walls and its amber lights and its smell of old data crystal. This one belonged to him. He had been filing designation receipts for the hegemony since before most currently living species had discovered fire. When the signal came in 12 seconds of compressed light, the standard format, absolutely routine, he opened it the way he had opened 300 before it. Read it. Stopped. The word that best described what happened next was not a word the archivist normally used, because he was the oldest neutral observer in the Compact, and neutral observers did not, as a rule, use this word about themselves. Fear. He read the target coordinates again. Sol System. The 3rd planet. The blue one. He pulled the file. The Compact maintained quiet observation files on every pre-contact species in the known galaxy. Had done so for millennia, and the file was there. And he read it. And his hands, which had not been unsteady in 4,000 years, were unsteady. He closed the file. Sat in the amber light. For a very long time he sat there. And the receipt that was supposed to be filed, the routine acknowledgement that the hegemony's designation had been received and logged 300 times before without a pause, a process that took 11 seconds, sat in his queue, unfiled. An hour passed. The receipt sat there. He got up, made himself a drink of something warm, stood at the chamber window, and looked out at the Compact's home station, the lights of 1,000 ships moving in slow orbit, the ordinary business of a galaxy that did not yet know what the hegemony had pointed itself at. He went back to his chair, pulled up the observation file again. This time he read the whole thing, all 40 years of it. The quiet reports filed by Compact observers who had watched the blue world from a careful distance and written their notes and sent them in, and never quite escalated them to the Threat Assessment Bureau because the notes were strange, and the Threat Assessment Bureau did not like strange. They liked clean categories. Boxes that fit, numbers that computed. The notes about Earth did not fit any box. The first report, 40 years ago, had said, "Species appears to be engaged in active warfare against itself on at least 7 simultaneous fronts. This is not territorial. This is not resource-based. They appear to engage in organized violence as a cultural practice. Monitoring recommended. The second report, the year after. Active conflict zones have increased to 11. Species has simultaneously launched 3 space exploration missions while maintaining the active conflicts. The combination of expansion drive and ongoing warfare is unusual. Monitoring strongly recommended. The 15th report. The species has ended 4 of its regional conflicts and immediately redirected the logistical infrastructure, the supply chains, the communication networks, the organizational frameworks built for war into civilian use. They appear to build everything the way they build weapons. Efficiently, with redundancy. Assuming it will need to survive damage. The 23rd report. Species has achieved low-orbit space capability and has deployed 47 communication satellites. Analysis of signal traffic suggests they are aware they are being observed. They have not made contact. They are learning our languages from our own transmissions. They have not told us they are doing this. The 31st report. Their history archives, which we have partially translated, suggest this species has been in a state of at least partial organized conflict for the entirety of their recorded civilization, approximately 10,000 years. There is no period in their historical record that corresponds to peace as other species understand it, a cessation of violence. Their peaceful periods are characterized by active preparation for the next conflict. They treat the interval between wars the way other species treat war itself, as the time when you work hardest. The archivist set down his drink. He thought about the Dorathi collective, who had surrendered to the hegemony 40 years ago. The Dorathi were not weak. They had a strong military, decent technology, organized command structures. They had looked at the hegemony's fleet and calculated the odds and chosen survival. Smart, rational, the correct choice. Most analysts agreed. He thought about the Uravaxi, who had resisted for 6 months before the numbers made resistance impossible. Brave. Ultimately, practical. He thought about every species he had ever watched receive a hegemony designation, and he thought about the one thing they all had in common. They had all, at the moment of calculation, had something to lose that they were not willing to burn. A homeworld they loved too much to see destroyed. A population they couldn't bear to watch die. A history they wanted to survive into the future. Something that put a ceiling on how far they would go, how much they would spend, how many of their own people they would feed into the machine before the calculation tipped toward surrender. Every species had that ceiling. The archivist had read 40 years of reports about Earth. He could not find the ceiling. On the 3rd planet of the Sol system, a woman named Keiko Watanabe was making breakfast. She was 43 years old. She lived in a small apartment in Osaka. She had 2 cats and a dying plant she kept meaning to replace, and a coffee maker that was older than her marriage and outlasted it. She worked for a translation software company. She was, by any measure, an ordinary person living an ordinary life on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She had no idea. The signal was still 11 hours out. Moving at the speed of light, bouncing off relay buoys, cutting through the dark between stars with the absolute indifference of physics. It would reach Earth in the early afternoon, local Japanese time. The deep space receivers at the far side array on the moon would catch it first. It would take 40 minutes for the automated systems to flag it, route it to the proper department, and wake up the analyst on duty. Keiko made her coffee. The cats wanted their breakfast. The plant looked worse than yesterday, 312 light-years away, in the Compact's emergency relay station at Kethsora. Ambassador Saren Voss was sitting in a diplomatic reception that had been going on for 6 hours and showed no sign of stopping. The Kethsorans were a patient species. They measured hospitality in duration. The longer a gathering went on, the more honored the guest was considered to be. Saren Voss had been their honored guest since the previous afternoon, and she had eaten things she would not think about later, and listened to 3 ceremonial speeches about trade relationships, and smiled the smile of a diplomat, which is not a real smile but a very good mask for exhaustion. Her personal channel chimed. She felt the chime on her wrist, the small coded vibration that meant Times Priority 1 Compact designation receipt. She kept her face still. Diplomats learned that first. Nothing on your face that isn't a choice. She excused herself in the polite way, the way that doesn't interrupt, and stepped into the small side corridor off the reception hall and looked at her wrist display. Read the designation receipt. The chime was routine. Designation receipts came in 2 or 3 times a year, the hegemony's pace of conquest, steady and grinding, and unpleasant to think about, but ultimately something you filed away, and noted, and moved on from. Because there was nothing the compact could do about the hegemony, and everyone had known that for a long time, and you learned to live with the knowledge. Saren Voss read the target coordinates. She was holding a small ceramic cup of blue root tea, a Kethsoran ceremonial tea, very hot, that she had been drinking because to refuse it would have been an insult. She didn't notice when she tilted the cup, didn't notice the tea running down the front of her formal diplomatic sash, blue-green against the pale fabric, spreading out in a slow stain. She was reading the coordinates for the 3rd time. Sol System. She knew about Sol System. Every diplomat of her generation knew about Sol System. In the quiet way you knew about things that your bureau had quietly decided not to officially worry about. The observation reports had circulated at her level. She'd read them 5 years ago and filed them under times unusual but low-priority times and moved on, because that was what her bureau told her to do. She thought about those reports now. She thought about the one line from the 23rd report that had stayed with her, even after she'd filed it, and told herself it wasn't her concern. They are learning our languages from our own transmissions. They have not told us they are doing this. She thought about what that meant. Not the fact of it, lots of young species tried to decode compact transmissions. But the choice. The specific choice to learn and stay silent. To know and not announce knowing. To watch while being watched and give nothing away. She thought about the hegemony, which had spent 600 years building a machine of conquest on the bedrock assumption that every species, when threatened, would eventually choose to survive over choosing to fight. Her tea finished dripping off her sash and hit the floor. She didn't look down. At the Compact's Hall of Records, the archivist finally filed the receipt. Standard format, correct timestamp. Technically, he'd backdated it by the 11 minutes he'd spent sitting in the amber light not filing it. No one would notice. No one ever looked at the metadata on designation receipts. They were the most routine documents in the Compact's archive, 300 of them in 6 centuries. Always the same, never worth examining. But before he closed the file, he added something he had never added to any designation receipt before: a flag. The Compact's archive system had a flag classification that had not been used in 4,000 years, not since before the archivist had taken this post. He'd found it once, early in his tenure, deep in the system's legacy code, a relic of the first archivists, a classification so old that the display rendered it in a script that was no longer taught. Apex class contact. It had last been applied to a species that no longer existed. The archivist applied it to Earth, closed the file, looked at his hands for a while. Then he did something he had not done in 4,000 years of watching species rise and burn and fall and sometimes rise again. He opened a personal note, not for the official record, not for any bureau, not for any eye but his own, and he wrote in it, "The hegemony has made a mistake." He sat with that for a moment, added, "I don't think they know it yet." He thought about the blue world, the 40 years of reports, the species that had spent 10,000 years at war with itself and was still there, still standing, still building, still looking up. He added one final line, "I hope the damage is small." He closed the note. The signal from the hegemony was still moving through the dark, still 11 hours from Earth, still carrying its clean and precise and utterly confident message to a world that had no idea it was coming. Somewhere in Osaka, a woman's coffee was getting cold. Somewhere in Lagos, a man named Yusuf Adeyemi was finishing a night shift and walking home in the early morning, and the street was quiet, and the air smelled like rain coming, and he looked up at the sky the way he sometimes did. Not because he expected anything, just because it was there. The sky looked the same as always. It wouldn't, soon, but right now, in this last ordinary hour before the signal arrived and everything that came after arrived with it, the sky over Lagos was dark and quiet and full of stars, and somewhere among those stars, a 12-second message was moving toward them at the speed of light. And in the deepest archive room of the Galactic Compact's Hall of Records, in the amber light, the oldest living observer in the known galaxy sat with his personal note and his cold drink and something new living in his chest that he hadn't felt in 4,000 years. He didn't sleep that night. He just sat there, and waited for whatever was going to happen next. The panic did not start on Earth. Earth didn't even know yet. The signal was still moving. Light travels fast, but the universe is large and indifferent to urgency, and the 12 seconds of compressed transmission from the hegemony's relay buoys was still crossing the dark between stars, while the galaxy it was aimed at started to come apart at the seams. The panic started on a space station, Kethsora Central Hub. Third level, a side corridor off a diplomatic reception room where a Kashari ambassador was standing in a spreading tea stain she hadn't noticed, reading the same 11 words for the 4th time, and the reception was still going on 12 feet away, and she could hear the ceremonial music and the polite laughter of people who didn't know yet. Saren Voss stood very still. The thing about diplomats, the real ones, the ones who had been doing it long enough to have their reactions completely under control, was that they could hold a panic inside them the way a bottle holds something under pressure. You couldn't see it from outside. The seal held. But you could feel it, if you were the bottle. She felt it now. She had worked in the Compact's diplomatic corps for 22 years. She had filed reports on 42 pre-contact species. She had attended 9 hegemony designations. 9 times she had read the receipt, noted the target world, marked it in her calendar under Times Monitor for developments, and gone back to whatever she was doing. 9 times the math had been obvious and the outcome had been obvious, and the only real question had been timing. She looked at the target coordinates of the 10th designation. The math was not obvious. She thought about a report she'd read 5 years ago, from an observer named Tenha, who had spent 6 months stationed near Sol System and had filed detailed notes on the 3rd planet's communication signals. Tenha had been a careful observer, precise, not given to dramatic language. Tenha had used the phrase times operationally, alarming times only twice in her entire career. She had used it twice in the same report about Earth. Saren Voss went back into the reception, smiled the diplomatic smile, made her excuses in the correct form. The form that communicated times emergency, requiring immediate departure times, without communicating anything about the nature of the emergency. The Kethsorans were old enough and experienced enough to read the form correctly. They let her go without pressing. She was in her shuttle before the reception ended, on her comm before the shuttle cleared the docking bay, calling people she hadn't called in 5 years. By the time Saren Voss's shuttle docked at the Compact's main diplomatic station, 6 hours after the signal fired, the emergency channels were already burning. The Yeravaxi had called an emergency session of the Compact Security Council. This was not unusual. The Yeravaxi called emergency sessions the way some species sneezed, reflexively and often. What was unusual was that the Compact Security Council had agreed to convene immediately, without the standard 48-hour notice period, without the procedural reviews, without the 17 separate committees that normally had to sign off on an emergency session before it became official. They had convened in 4 hours. That had never happened before. The Dorothi Collective, who had surrendered to the hegemony 40 years ago and integrated into the hegemony's administrative structure and spent the 4 decades since being very careful about what they said on Compact, channels were transmitting on every Compact frequency simultaneously. Every frequency. Every one. The last time the Dorothi had done that was when their homeworld was burning and they were sending a distress call that came too late. Saren Voss watched the Dorothi transmissions come in on her display as her shuttle docked, and she tried to read them and understand what she was feeling. The Dorothi messages were fragmented, emotional in a way Dorothi communication rarely was, and they all said variations of the same thing in different forms. Do not let this happen. Stop this. You don't understand what you're doing. That last one was not addressed to the Compact. It was addressed to the hegemony. The Pellucid Minds issued a statement. This was, by itself, an event significant enough to stop conversations across 3 star systems. The Pellucid Minds did not issue statements. The Pellucid Minds were the oldest continuous civilization in the known galaxy, after the Archivist's own people, and they had not issued a formal statement to the Compact in 200 years, because their philosophy held that observation was the only clean interaction with the universe, and all other forms of engagement were, in one way or another, a form of contamination. They watched. That was all. That was what they did. That was what they had done for longer than the hegemony had existed. Their statement was 11 words. We recommend immediate Compact intervention in the Sol System designation. No elaboration, no explanation. No precedent for interpreting what times immediate compact intervention times would even mean, given that the compact had never once intervened in a hegemony designation in 600 years of hegemony designations. Just 11 words. The Security Council read them. Read them again. Someone in the chamber, Saren Voss, would later hear it was the Yerevaxi council speaker. Though she couldn't confirm it said out loud what everyone was thinking. The pellucid minds have never recommended anything. In 200 years, they observe. That's all they do. And then the chamber was quiet for a long time. Saren Voss spent 3 days not sleeping. She had the observation file on Earth. The full file, 40 years of it, which she had requisitioned from the archivist's archive the morning after the designation, with the highest level authorization her position allowed. The archivist had sent it within minutes of the request, without the standard processing delay. That itself told her something. She read it in order, first report to last. She took notes the way she hadn't taken notes since her training, actual notes, written down, not recorded, because she needed her hands to be doing something or she was going to vibrate out of her skin. The notes were not organized. She was not in an organized state. Report 7. They have 17 distinct regional languages still in active daily use, and a constructed global communication language that a significant portion of the population does not consider a real language, but uses, anyway, for practical purposes. The tension between these two things does not impede function. They seem to find the tension normal. Report 12. They have maintained standing military forces in a state of active readiness for at least 300 consecutive years. Not readiness for a specific threat. Readiness as a default condition. The military is not a response to danger. It is a background state. Report 19. They have had at least 4 separate occasions where a single individual, with access to the correct technology, could have caused an extinction-level event. On each occasion, the extinction-level event did not occur. It is not entirely clear why. Their own historical analyses credit different factors each time. The consistent element appears to be other individuals acting individually, outside formal structures, on their own judgment who stopped it. Report 27. They argue, constantly, about everything. Their governing systems appear to be built specifically to allow and contain and direct the energy of argument into something that produces decisions. This is not inefficiency. It is load-bearing. The argument is the structure. Report 35. There is a concept in their primary surviving ancient languages. The word differs by language, but the concept is consistent that translates approximately as the thing worth dying for. Not an abstraction. A practical category. The majority of their adult population, when surveyed, can name something in this category without hesitation. Most species, when surveyed, find the question confusing. Saren Voss put down her pen, picked it up again. Report 40 final. The species has achieved reliable deep space communication capability and is aware of the compact's existence. They have not made contact. When our observers attempted to analyze why, the best current theory is that they are waiting until they have something specific to say. They are not afraid of us. They are not awed by us. They are, in the most accurate translation available, curious. End of active observation cycle. Bureau recommendation. Continue passive monitoring. No escalation required. She stared at times, no escalation required times for a long time. She thought about the analyst who had written that. Probably careful. Probably cautious. Probably using the framework they'd been trained with. The framework that said a pre-contact species with no FTL capability and no first contact wasn't an escalation concern, regardless of how strange the observation notes were. The framework that had never been designed to ask the question, what happens when the hegemony points its designation machine at something that doesn't behave like prey? She typed up a memo to the Security Council, deleted it, typed it again. The problem was she didn't know what to say. What did you tell the Security Council? Don't let the hegemony do. This times was not a policy. This will end badly for someone. Times was not specific enough. And the honest version times, I have read 40 years of observation reports, and I cannot find a ceiling on these people, and that terrifies me, in a way I cannot justify with. Math times was not the kind of thing you put in a Security Council memo. She sent the memo anyway. All 400 words of it. The Security Council acknowledged receipt. Did nothing. The hegemony watched the compact's emergency channels with something that looked like amusement. Erkan received a report from his intelligence division times. Compact species experiencing elevated communication activity regarding Sol designation times, and read it and set it aside. The compact always got nervous about designations. They didn't like the hegemony's methods. They had made their position on this clear 600 years ago, and the hegemony had made its position clear in response. And the two positions had existed in a kind of stable, mutual contempt ever since. The compact would hold emergency sessions, issue statements, send strongly worded diplomatic notes that would arrive after the absorption was already complete. This was the pattern. It had been the pattern for 600 years. His analysts confirmed. Compact reaction was within normal parameters. He was more interested in the supply chain issue on World 298. He spent most of the afternoon on that. 11 hours and 40 minutes after the signal fired, the Farside array on Earth's moon caught it. The array's automated systems flagged it in 7 minutes, routed it to the Deep Space Communication Division of the Combined Space Agency in 6 more. Woke up the duty analyst, a man named Dr. Paulo Reyes, who had been asleep for 3 hours after a 14-hour shift, and was deeply unhappy about the wake-up call in another 4. Dr. Reyes looked at the raw signal, looked at the encoding format, looked at the signal again. His hands were steady because he was too tired for them to shake. He called his division head. His division head called the director. The director called 3 other directors. The chain of calls took 22 minutes and moved faster than it ever had in the history of the agency, because the duty analyst had put a single note in the top of the routing file. This is not from us. In Lagos, Nigeria, at a building that did not appear on any public map, and had a sign on the door that said, Times Regional Water Management Authority, Times in 3 languages, Colonel Yusuf Adeyemi arrived at 0300 hours. He had not been called. He had woken up on his own, the way he sometimes did when something was happening that he needed to know about. A skill built from 30 years of work in places where sleeping through important things got people killed. He made tea. His adjutant, Lieutenant Chidi Okafor, arrived at 0310 with the decoded preliminary analysis and the expression of a person who was trying very hard not to have any expression at all. Sir, said Okafor. I know, said Adeyemi. You haven't read the file yet. I know the shape of it. Adeyemi held out his hand for the file. Okafor gave it to him. He read it while his tea finished steeping, set the file on the table, picked up his tea. Start the protocol. Which protocol, sir? Adeyemi looked at him with the specific look that meant times the one we've had ready for 15 years. The one we built specifically for this. The one that we hoped we would never use and fully expected to use. The one that's been sitting in the contingency drawer like a fire extinguisher. Waiting. First contact hostile designation, he said. Okafor nodded. Went to his station. The machine started moving. Quiet calls to quiet numbers. The kind of infrastructure that doesn't announce itself and doesn't need to. The kind that a species builds when it has spent 10,000 years learning what you need to have ready, and where you need to have it ready, and how fast you need to be able to move it. Adeyemi drank his tea. Looked out the window at Lagos in the early dark, the city already beginning to wake. Lights coming on in apartments. The sound of the first morning traffic somewhere below. Someone's radio playing something he couldn't quite hear. He thought about the file. Thought about what was in it. Thought about the 300 worlds before Earth. Thought about what those worlds had in common. He turned away from the window. Okafor. Sir, make sure the communication team is ready. We're going to need to send a response. He paused. The right one. What's the right one, sir? Adeyemi picked up the designation file again. Read the last line of the hegemony's message. Projected compliance window. 14 cycles. None. I haven't decided yet, he said. But I will. He sat down at his desk, opened a blank document, started thinking. Outside the window, Lagos was waking up. The galaxy was in a panic. The hegemony was confident. The archivist was afraid in his amber room. Saren Voss was on her 4th day without sleep, and her 7th draft of a memo that couldn't say what it meant. And, in a building with the wrong name on the door, in a city that had survived everything the world had thrown at it, and come out the other side still standing, a man drank the last of his tea and thought about what you say to something that has never been told no before. He thought about it carefully. He was going to get this right. The response protocol had existed for 15 years. Not officially. There was no document with that name in any official archive. No committee that had voted on it. No minister who had publicly signed off on it. But it existed the same way a lot of important things exist in the hands of the right people. Shared quietly. Updated quietly. Never announced, because announcing it would require explaining why you needed it, and explaining that would require admitting that you had been watching the sky and expecting something and didn't want to say so out loud. Colonel Adeyemi had written the first version himself, in a basement office, on a Wednesday afternoon, with bad coffee and a clearer head than most people gave him credit for. He had written it because that was what you did when you saw something coming. You got ready, not loudly, not in a way that caused panic. You just made sure that when the moment arrived, the next step was already known. The moment had arrived. He spent 11 hours on the response. Not because he was slow, because he was careful in the specific way that people are careful when they know that the next words out of their mouth will either make things better or make them much, much worse. Every line got reviewed. Every word got questioned. The translation team worked in shifts, because the response had to be in the Compact's common trade language, which Earth had been quietly learning for 30 years, from intercepted Compact transmissions, and it had to be exactly right. Not threatening, not weak, not dramatic. Exactly what it needed to be. 11 hours in, Adeyemi had a draft he could live with. He read it to his senior staff in the conference room. 12 people around a table, each of them carrying their reactions very carefully, the way you carry something full and fragile. When he finished reading, the room was quiet for a moment. Major Ifeoma Nwachukwu, who had been in the room for every version of this protocol since the third draft and had argued with Adeyemi about the tone in each one, said, "The question at the end. Yes, they'll know what it means." "Yes," said Adeyemi. "Is that what we want?" He set down the document. "We want them to know exactly what it means. We want no ambiguity at all." He looked at her. "That's the whole point." Another pause. Lieutenant Okafor, who was 29 years old and had been in this unit for 2 years and had spent most of that time hoping this moment would never come, and was now sitting very still in the knowledge that it had. "Sir, are we sure?" "No," said Adeyemi. "But we're going." He signed the document. The response was 22 seconds long. 22 seconds because that was what was needed. Not dramatic, not long, not a speech, or a declaration, or a list of capabilities, or a threat wrapped in diplomatic language. Just a message, clean and plain, in the Compact's common trade tongue, sent on the same frequencies the hegemony used. The first part was an acknowledgement of receipt. Standard format. The hegemony would recognize the format because the hegemony had used that format 300 times and knew what an acknowledgement of receipt looked like. This one would look slightly different in one specific way. It acknowledged receipt in the Compact's common trade language, not hegemony standard code, not a distress signal, not a prayer. The trade language, the one that every civilized species in the galaxy used for actual communication, the one that Earth wasn't supposed to know yet. The hegemony would notice. The Compact would notice. The archivist would notice. Everyone who received this message and everyone would receive this message, because Earth sent it on every available frequency, which was a choice. Not an accident would notice the same thing simultaneously. The species being designated had been listening, had learned, had not said so, until now. The second part was the question. It came after a pause, not a dramatic pause, just the pause of someone who had thought carefully about what they were about to say and wanted to be sure it landed clearly. Of the 300 worlds you have absorbed, how many of them knew they were going to lose? A beat. We are asking because we want to understand what is different about this one. That was it. 22 seconds. Saren Voss received it 6 minutes before the hegemony did, because of geometry. Sol System's position relative to the Compact's relay network gave her a 6-minute window, and she used every second of it. She played it once, sat there, played it again, called in her 3 senior staff, Commander Ress, Dr. Pavath, and a young analyst named Soren who had been with her for 8 months and had the particular look of someone whose entire framework for the universe was quietly dissolving, and she played it a 3rd time, for all of them. Together, when it ended, the amber light of the analysis suite sat on all 4 of them, and no one said anything for a while. Ress said, "They knew the trade language. For at least 30 years, said Saren Voss. Possibly longer. The observation reports. 30 years of knowing, said Ress. Without telling us. Yes. Pavath, who was the oldest of the three and had a way of getting to the center of things quickly. The question isn't a question. No, said Saren Voss. It's a statement. They're telling the hegemony that they know the pattern, that they've studied it, that they've looked at 300 worlds and drawn a specific conclusion about them and are now putting that conclusion directly in front of the species that conquered them. Pavath turned to look at the display where the message had played. They're not asking the hegemony anything. They're telling the hegemony that they're different, and they know it, and they want the hegemony to sit with that. Soren said, very quietly, "Is that brave, or is that—" "Both," said Saren Voss. She sat down. She had not sat down properly in 4 days. She had been moving, calling, drafting, reviewing, moving again. Now she sat and felt the weight of the last 4 days settle onto her, and looked at the display, and thought about the question times. What is different about this one times? And thought about 40 years of observation reports, and thought about the answer, which she had known for 4 days and which the hegemony was going to have to arrive at on its own. What was different was that Earth had not, in the message, enumerated its weapons, had not listed its fleet strength or its troop numbers or its defensive capabilities, had not made a threat, had not made a promise, had not appealed to the compact for help or named any allies. It had asked one question, and the question, underneath its plain language, was doing something much more specific. It was drawing a line between every world the hegemony had ever conquered and this one. It was saying, those worlds did not know they were going to lose. We are not in that category. We are asking you to think carefully about what that means. It was, in Saren Voss's assessment, the most precise communication she had seen in 22 years of diplomatic work. She sent a message to Adeyemi. Personal frequency, encrypted. She told him that she had read 40 years of observation reports about his species. She told him what she knew about the hegemony's models, their frameworks, the specific way their conquest machine was built and what it assumed. She told him that the hegemony was coming with a fleet and a plan and 600 years of unbroken confidence behind it. She typed the last part carefully. I don't know if this helps. I don't know what you're going to do. I just needed to tell you what you're facing. I'm sorry we didn't introduce ourselves sooner. She sent it, stared at the screen. Urkan received the Earth transmission at 0600 hours. Ship time. He was having his morning meal. He read the designation acknowledgement. First, the format was correct, which was good. The correct format suggested a species capable of basic compliance, and then he read the language it was in and set down his food. Trade tongue. He called in his communications lead. This transmission is in trade tongue. Yes, fleet designate. Earth does not have trade tongue capability. They're class 3. Pre-contact. Yes, fleet designate. The communications lead had the expression of someone standing at the edge of something they didn't want to look directly at. The transmission is nonetheless in trade tongue, clean, fluent, no translation artifacts. Urkan looked at the message again. Read the question. Read it again. Of the 300 worlds you have absorbed, how many of them knew they were going to lose? He had a feeling he hadn't had in a very long time. It was not fear. He didn't classify it as fear. He classified it as the specific sensation of data that did not fit his model, the friction of an unexpected variable, the small wrong feeling of a step that lands wrong. Send the standard compliance requirement, he said. Sir. Should we? Standard compliance requirement, he said. 14 cycles, as planned. He finished his meal, but he read the question a 4th time before he cleared his screen. He read it 4 times that day, total. He didn't tell anyone. The Compact's emergency channels erupted again when the Earth transmission went public. The Security Council session that had been grinding along for days, procedural debates, failed votes, the magnificent impotence of a large committee facing something it had no tool for, stopped being a procedural debate. Because the question Earth had asked the hegemony was now the question the Compact was asking itself. How many of the 300 absorbed worlds knew they were going to lose? All of them. Every single one. Every species that had received a hegemony designation had looked at the numbers, run the calculations, and known. And the knowledge, the certainty of what was coming had been the thing that tipped them into compliance. Because if you knew you were going to lose, you started thinking about what losing would cost and how to lose in the way that left the most alive. Saren Voss sat in the Security Council gallery and watched the session and thought about Earth's question in a different way. Not the way the hegemony was supposed to think about it. The way she was thinking about it now. We are asking because we want to understand what is different about this one. The difference wasn't weapons, wasn't fleet strength, wasn't technology. The difference was the calculation. 300 worlds had run the calculation and reached a ceiling, a point beyond which they weren't willing to go, a cost they weren't willing to pay. That ceiling was the thing the hegemony's machine was built for. Find the ceiling. Apply pressure until the species hits it. Watch them choose survival. Earth had not, in its message, indicated a ceiling. Earth had not, in 40 years of observation, indicated a ceiling. Earth had, historically, repeatedly spent costs that other species would not pay, had fed its own people into difficult things, and kept going. Not because it didn't value its people, the observation reports were very clear that it did. Enormously, passionately, sometimes in ways that broke into public violence when it felt those people weren't being valued correctly, but because it had a different relationship with loss than other species. It did not treat loss as a reason to stop. It treated loss as information. Saren Voss thought, the hegemony has never met something that treats loss as information. Her comm chimed, Adeyemi's reply to her message. Short, 4 words. Ambassador. With respect. We know. She stared at it for a long time. There was something in those 4 words that she couldn't quite name. Not bravado. Not performance. It was the specific tone of someone who had been carrying a piece of knowledge for a long time and was now simply confirming that yes, they had it. Yes, they had always had it. Yes, they had built around it and planned around it and were not surprised to be in this moment. She typed back, what are you going to do? Waited. His reply took 20 minutes. She imagined him in that building with the wrong name on the door, in the early Lagos morning, tea going cold, maps on the walls. The same thing we always do. She didn't know exactly what that meant. She was becoming increasingly certain that the hegemony didn't either. And in the Hall of Records, the archivist had added a new note to his private file. Not a long one. They replied in our language. They have been listening for 30 years, and they waited until this moment to say so. They are telling the galaxy something, not just the hegemony, all of us. He thought about what the something was, wrote it down. They are telling us they have been paying attention. They are telling us they are ready. They are telling us they are not afraid in the way we expected them to be afraid. He looked at the note, added the last line. I think they have been ready for a very long time. The hegemony's first absorption fleet dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Sol system on a Tuesday. Local Earth time, 0440 hours. The system's outer sensor net picked them up in 4 minutes. The alert reached Adeyemi's desk in 12. He was already awake, already at his desk, had been at his desk since 0300, the way he had been every morning for the past 6 weeks, because there was no version of this moment that came without warning, and he had spent 6 weeks making sure everything that needed to be in place was in place. He looked at the sensor report, 412 ships. He drank his tea, looked at the report again, put the number away in the part of his brain where he kept things that were true and needed to be worked with rather than reacted to. Okafor? He said. Sir, send the greeting. The greeting was also part of the protocol. Plain language, trade tongue, sent on every frequency. Not hostile, not pleading. Factual in the way that a door being closed is factual. It doesn't argue, it doesn't threaten. It simply exists as a statement about what is and isn't going to happen. You are entering the Sol system. This is our home. We have received your designation, and we are choosing not to comply. We are prepared to discuss any alternative you wish to offer. If you proceed with the absorption sequence as planned, we will resist. We want to be clear on that point, so there is no confusion later. Orkan read the greeting on the bridge of the Times Eternal Meridian Times while his fleet finished its FTL emergence sequence. He read it twice. Around him, the bridge crew was running standard absorption approach protocols, sensor sweeps, defensive analysis, target mapping, and the readouts were coming back in ways that were technically within expected parameters, and yet were accumulating in a specific direction, that his senior analyst was going to have to explain to him. Fleet designate. His senior analyst, Varsethis, approached with a data tablet held in the careful way of someone who had information they weren't sure how to present. Tell me. They're defensive systems, sir. We're having some difficulty categorizing them. Categorize them. Varsethis looked at the tablet, looked at Urkan, looked at the tablet again. We can identify the component technologies. Individually, none of them are beyond what we've encountered. The difficulty is the arrangement. What about it? We have no model for it. Varsethis paused. It appears to have been designed assuming that we specifically would be the attacking force. They have addressed our standard approach vectors with specific countermeasures. They have anticipated our first 3 tactical phases. Urkan looked at the main display. The blue-green planet sat in the dark, ordinary-looking, the way it had always been described in its designation file. They've been studying us, he said. Yes, fleet designate. For what appears to be based on the sophistication of the adaptations at least 10 years. 10 years. The designation was 6 weeks old. 10 years before the designation, Earth had started preparing for this specific fleet with this specific tactical approach. How? He said. Varsethis hesitated. Our historical combat data is available in certain compact archives. There have been observer reports filed on every hegemony engagement for the past 60 years. They are technically restricted, but the restriction protocols are. They read our battle records. Yes, sir. And built their defense around them. Yes, sir. And Urkan stood on his bridge and looked at the planet and thought about the greeting they'd sent. We want to be clear on that point so there is no confusion later. He had read that line and thought it was a bluff, the specific bluff of a species that had never actually been in a fight at this scale and didn't understand what they were up against. He was reconsidering that assessment. Proceed with standard approach, he said. Phase 1. Phase 1 took longer than expected, by 3 hours. Phase 1 was not combat, it was approach positioning, fleet arrangement, the geometry of bringing 412 ships into optimal firing configuration. The hegemony had done this 300 times and it took a standard and predictable amount of time. It took longer here because Earth's orbital defense network had repositioned overnight in a way that directly complicated the standard approach geometry. Not blocked it, not stopped it, made it more expensive in time and fuel. Just enough to be noticeable. Varsethis filed a note. Urkan read it. Phase 1 was completed. Phase 2? The formal demand for compliance. The last opportunity for the target world to choose the correct path before engagement began was transmitted at 1,200 hours. Earth's response arrived in 40 minutes. It said, "No thank you." 3 words. Grammatically correct. Polite and register. No elaboration. The bridge was very quiet for a moment. Urkan said, "Begin engagement." Saren Voss watched the early engagement reports from the Compact's relay station and started a new section in her observation file. She had been keeping the file since the designation was issued. It had become something she worked on the way other people worked on, coping mechanisms, structured, methodical, a way of managing the things she was watching by putting them in order. The early reports were confusing even for someone who had studied Earth. Standard hegemony engagements followed a pattern that Saren Voss knew well. The first phase of actual combat was overwhelming and short. The hegemony brought 400 ships because you didn't need 400 ships, you needed the number that, when the target world's leadership looked at it on their sensors, made the calculation obvious. The ships were as much statement as weapon. Earth's leadership had looked at 412 ships, and apparently done the calculation differently. The engagement lasted 3 days before the first significant development. Not 3 days of constant fighting, punctuated, partial, the hegemony probing, pulling back, adjusting, probing again. The rhythm of a force used to quick resolution running into something that wasn't resolving quickly. On the 3rd day, one of the hegemony's destroyer-class ships was taken out of combat. Not destroyed, disabled. Systematically, surgically, with a targeting approach that Varsethis' report described as times indicating familiarity with our ship architecture at a component level. They knew where the systems were. They knew which components, disabled in which sequence, would take a ship out without blowing it up. They had been studying hegemony ship design the way a surgeon studies anatomy, not to kill but to stop. Precisely, at the right point. Saren Voss wrote in her file. They are not trying to destroy. They are trying to demonstrate. She wasn't sure who she was writing it for at this point. Herself, maybe. Week 3. The compliance window was 14 cycles, which in hegemony standard time was approximately 42 Earth days. They were at week 3. They were not ahead of schedule. Urkan held his daily briefings and listened to Varsathis and his senior commanders explain the previous day's engagements, and something was wrong that he couldn't quite name. Not the numbers were, technically, within range. Losses were higher than projected but not catastrophic. The fleet was still 401 ships. Earth's orbital defense network had been degraded by approximately 30%. What was wrong was the pattern. In every engagement against every other world, there had been a moment he could always identify it afterward. Sometimes during when the resistance changed quality. When you could feel the other side calculating, measuring costs against survival. The fighting would continue after that moment, sometimes for a long time, but it was different. There was a negotiation underneath it, an unspoken conversation about what compliance would look like and what terms were available, and what the path to survival was. He was looking for that moment. He had not found it. He pushed harder. Second Fleet elements. More pressure on the ground side defense infrastructure. 3 days of continuous engagement without pause. The approach he'd used on World 291 to break a particularly difficult resistance in 6 days. Earth's defense adjusted within the first day. Not perfectly. They took losses. More losses than the previous week. He could see it in the numbers. They were spending people and resources at a rate that should have been producing the calculation, should have been pushing them toward the unspoken conversation. He got a communication from Earth's command structure on the 9th day of that 3-day push. Plain language. Trade tongue. You seem frustrated. We want to be helpful where possible. Is there anything specific you'd like to discuss? He stared at it for a very long time. His communications lead looked at him from across the bridge and said, nothing. He put the communication down without responding. Week 6. The Compact Security Council session was still running. It had been running continuously for 6 weeks, which was a record. The procedural debates had been replaced by something else, not debate. Not quite. More like the experience of watching something that none of them had a category for, and trying to develop the category in real time. Ambassador Saren Voss had stopped sleeping properly. She was functioning on 4 hours a night and an amount of blue root tea that was starting to affect her hands. The data she was looking at was, from certain angles, not surprising. She had read the observation reports. She had known, in the abstract, what Earth was. The abstract and the actual were different experiences. The actual was, in 6 weeks of engagement, the hegemony had committed its first fleet, significant elements of its second fleet, and was now moving its third fleet into position. 3 fleets. The hegemony had never used 3 fleets on a single designation. The actual was, Earth's resistance had not decreased in the way hegemony models predicted. It had adapted. Every new hegemony tactical approach had been met with an adjustment. Not a perfect adjustment. Earth was taking losses, real losses, and Saren Voss did not let herself look away from that, but an adjustment that indicated an organizational capacity to process loss, incorporate it, and change. The actual was, in week 5, the hegemony had attempted the approach that had worked on the Dorathi Collective 40 years ago. The approach that had broken the Dorathi in 3 days. A concentrated strike on what hegemony analysts had identified as Earth's primary command infrastructure, intended to remove the organizational center and produce collapse. Earth's primary command infrastructure had turned out to not be in the places hegemony analysts had identified. It had turned out to be everywhere. Distributed, redundant, built specifically to survive decapitation, as if the people who designed it had known, from long experience, that someone would eventually come looking for the head, and you needed to have already solved for that problem. Commander Ress looked at the engagement data and said, in the quiet of the analysis suite, they built their entire command structure, assuming they would lose the center. They built it to work without a center. Saren Voss nodded. Who builds like that? Species that have fought themselves, she said, extensively, for a long time. They've already seen someone try to cut off the head, multiple times. They built the answer into the architecture. Ress sat down. How do you beat that? Saren Voss thought about this. I don't know, she said. But I think the hegemony is starting to wonder the same thing. Week 8. Khan sent a message to Hegemony Command. He spent a long time writing it. Longer than he'd spent writing anything in 300 designations. He was precise by nature, trained to be exact. And he understood that what he was about to say would be read by people who had never had to say it before and would not want to believe it. He sent it anyway, because the honest message was the necessary message. The message used one word that Khan had not used in 600 years of hegemony history. Miscalculation. He did not elaborate. He did not need to elaborate. The word was the message. Anyone who received it and understood the hegemony and understood what was happening in the Sol system would understand everything that came after the word without needing it written down. He sent the message, sat back on his bridge, looked at the blue-green planet on the main display, thought about a question that had been sitting in the back of his mind since week 1, since the moment Varsathus told him they had no model for Earth's defensive arrangement. He thought about 300 worlds, 300 designation files, 300 species that had looked at his fleet and done the calculation and found the right answer. He thought about the specific thing those 300 worlds had all shared. He looked at Earth. He thought, they knew they might lose, and they came anyway. He didn't say it out loud. He looked at his fleet. He thought about what the next step was and what it would cost and what it would produce. He thought for a very long time. On the planet below, in the early morning of a Lagos Tuesday, a man who had been awake for most of the night was looking at the same engagement data from the other side. The data that showed costs, real costs, a number that Adeyemi looked at every morning and put into the same part of his brain as all the other true things that had to be worked with rather than reacted to. He looked at it, made himself another cup of tea, and waited. The hegemony withdrew on a Thursday. Not at once. Not with anything as clean as an order followed immediately and completely. It was a slow pulling back, the way a hand pulls back from something hot, a recognition that came before the decision, a change in behavior that was already happening by the time the decision was formalized. Khan issued the withdrawal order on the morning of day 59. He issued it in the standard military format, with the standard encryption, filed through the standard channels. He did not hold a ceremony. He did not call the fleet together. He issued the order and went back to his cabin and sat in the dark for a while. His fleet began moving. It took 3 days for the full withdrawal to complete 401 ships, down from 412, the 11 missing ones sitting in Earth's orbital space in various states of disabled and captured, and serving as a kind of unasked-for inventory of what had gone wrong and why. Earth watched them go. Earth did not celebrate on the communication channels, did not send a victory message, did not call the compact to announce what had happened. The communication channels stayed exactly as they had been during the engagement: clear, functional, open. The channel never closed. 3 weeks after the withdrawal, the hegemony sent a message. It was addressed to Times, the governing body of Earth. Sol system. The hegemony had never addressed a message this way before, had never needed to, because the standard post-designation communication went to the newly integrated administrative unit, the former governing body now absorbed and operating under hegemony administrative code. This was different. This was addressed to an entity that had not been absorbed. The message was not an apology. The hegemony did not have the specific architecture for apology. 600 years of unbroken conquest had removed that word from their formal diplomatic vocabulary, the way disuse removes a muscle. They had the word technically. They did not have the practice of it. What the message was, technically, was an acknowledgement in the formal diplomatic register, which was, in hegemony terms, the most serious register. The register where formal things happened that had weight. It said in clean trade tongue, the hegemony acknowledges the outcome of the Sol system engagement. We acknowledge the capability and resistance of the Earth governing bodies. We seek to open a formal diplomatic channel at a mutually agreeable time. That was all. Adeyemi read it at his desk. Set it down, in the exact same movement, the exact same pause, as the morning he'd set down the original designation file. Okafor, who had been with him for all of it, and had by now developed a detailed map of Adeyemi's expressions, watched him and said nothing. Adeyemi picked up his tea. Start the diplomatic response protocol, he said. We have one of those, sir? We have one of everything, Okafor. Saren Voss filed her report 3 weeks after the withdrawal. She had been drafting versions of it for the entire 59 days of the engagement. Deleted them. Started again. Deleted those. The problem was that the standard report format had been designed for standard events, and what had happened in the Sol system was not a standard event, and the format kept trying to flatten it into something smaller than it was. She gave up on the format. She wrote 412 pages. It was the longest report in the Compact's diplomatic archive. It covered everything, the 40 years of observation reports that had been quietly declined for escalation, the designation receipt, and the 6 weeks of Compact panic that followed, the Earth response and what it signaled, the full engagement, the tactical data, the hegemony's adjustment failures, the withdrawal, and what Saren Voss believed it all meant for the structure of the galaxy going forward. She had written longer private documents, but for the official record, 412 pages was a statement. The final paragraph was 11 words. She had written it 14 times. Each version said the same thing in slightly different language, and she had kept going back to it because it was uncomfortable, and she wanted to find a way to make it less uncomfortable, and she eventually stopped trying. We knew what they were. We should have introduced ourselves sooner. The Compact's Bureau of Threat Assessment would argue about those 11 words for the next 100 years, about what times new times meant and when they had known, and what times should times implied about responsibility, and whether the Compact had any obligation to pre-contact species that fell within the hegemony's designation. Range. Saren Voss filed the report, did not wait for the argument to start. The formal seat offer came 2 months after the withdrawal. The Compact's Security Council, which had been in a state of continuous emergency session for 11 weeks, and was deeply tired, and not entirely sure who they were anymore by the end of it, voted unanimously to offer Earth a full diplomatic seat in the Galactic Compact. Unanimously, including the species that had argued hardest against intervention during the engagement, including the ones who had spent 6 weeks in procedural debate while the Sol system burned. Unanimous. Because at the end of it, the question of what you did with Earth was not actually a complicated question. You brought them in. You opened the door. You made the introduction that should have been made years ago. The vote took 4 minutes. Earth's response took 2 days. Not because they were uncertain, because they were thorough, and they wanted to be sure they understood what they were agreeing to, and they wanted to send the right people, and they wanted those people to be fully prepared. Earth accepted. The delegation arrived at the Compact's central hub on a Friday morning. 7 people. Saren Voss was in the receiving gallery when the shuttle docked, and she had prepared herself, had told herself she understood what she was going to see, that after 412 pages of her own report, she knew these people, as well as you could know, a species you'd never met, and she was wrong about being prepared, which she admitted to herself in the first minute. They looked so ordinary. That was the thing that got her. They walked through the docking corridor, 2 Compact security officers flanking them on each side, and they looked at the station around them with bright, interested eyes. They talked quietly to each other. One of them was eating something out of a small container she'd brought from home. One of them was sketching something on a paper notebook, which no species in the Compact had used in 2 centuries, just casually sketching the station architecture as they walked. Not military, not generals or strategists or the people who had built the thing that had just made the hegemony pull back for the first time in 600 years. Scientists. Linguists. A historian. A food scientist named Dr. Amara Diallo who, when the Compact's press division later asked her why she had been chosen, said, "Because you learn the most about a culture from what it feeds people." A linguist named Miriam Osei, 29 years old, who had apparently learned 6 Compact languages in the 3 months of the engagement from archived transmissions, and could now speak them all with a slight Lagos accent. Saren Voss met them in the gallery. She had prepared a speech. She had worked on it for a week. She wanted to say the right thing, the thing that acknowledged the distance between what the Compact had done and what it should have done, the thing that honored the engagement and the cost and the 59 days and the 11 ships and all of it. Miriam Osei looked at her, eating from her container, and said, "Ambassador Saren Voss, we've read your reports, all of them." She paused. The 40 years of them that weren't escalated. Not just the recent one. Saren Voss said, "I know. It's fine," said Miriam. It is not fine, said Saren Voss. She had said this in her head 100 times during the engagement, and it came out now without her deciding to say it. You could have been helped. We had the information. We had 40 years of knowing what you were, and we filed it and moved on. And when the hegemony pointed at you, we spent 6 weeks in committee while you— Ambassador. Miriam's voice was not unkind. It was patient in the specific way of someone who had thought about this already and arrived at a position she was comfortable with. We know. We handled it. We're here. She held out the container. It's jollof rice. It travels well. Do you want some? Saren Voss looked at the container, looked at Miriam. Yes, she said. The archivist requested a private audience, and got it. He met Miriam alone in a small room off the main archive, in the amber light. He had his notes in front of him, the private notes from the last 3 months, the ones not for the official record. He had been trying to figure out what to say to a member of this species since the moment he'd first applied the Apex class flag, and he had 4,000 years of experience to draw on, and he still wasn't sure. He said, I observed your species for 40 years, and filed reports that were not escalated. You want to apologize, said Miriam. She was looking at him with the calm attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what he was. Yes, you can. She tilted her head. We accept apologies. He had not expected that. He didn't know what he'd expected. I watched 4,000 years of civilizations. I have never seen what I saw in those 59 days. What did you see? He thought about it. He had 4,000 years of vocabulary, and this was still a hard sentence to build. I have watched 300 species receive a hegemony designation. Every single one of them, at some point in the engagement, started calculating, started thinking about what losing would cost, started looking for the ceiling. He paused. I could not find your ceiling. Miriam was quiet for a moment. We have one, she said. But it's very high. She said it simply, without pride, the way you say a fact about the weather. It's very high. It has to be. We've been through enough that we know the cost of letting things get past the ceiling. She looked at him. We're not fearless. We're just expensive. The archivist sat with that. Expensive. Not brave. Not limitless. Just expensive enough that the calculation that had worked on 300 other worlds didn't work here. He wrote it in his notes when she left. Opened the Apex class file. Added her exact words. We're not fearless. We're just expensive. Then he added his own last line, under everything else, in the old script that only he could still read. That is, I think, more terrifying than fearlessness. Fearlessness can be broken. Expense simply has to be paid or acknowledged as unpayable. The hegemony met something it could not afford. It will take them a long time to understand what that means. The hegemony's new models ran projections for 3 years. The analysis team that rebuilt the tactical and political models quietly, internally, without announcing they were doing it, filed a summary report that circulated through the upper command structure and was classified at the highest level, and was not shared outside the hegemony, and was summarized in the final line of its executive section as recommend indefinite suspension of Sol system-adjacent designations pending further analysis. There were 16 worlds in the Sol system-adjacent range, indefinite suspension. The report also included, as an appendix, a new category in the target assessment framework. The category had no official name in the final report because the analysts had argued about what to name it for 6 months and couldn't agree. One of them, in a draft version of the report that was later removed from the official record, had called it the Times Earth category, meaning the category of things that do not respond to the standard calculation because they have a different relationship with loss than the calculation assumes, meaning the category of things the hegemony could not afford. The category currently had 1 member. The hegemony's analysts were running quiet assessments on whether there were others. On a Thursday afternoon, in the galactic standard year that would later be referred to in compact histories as times the Sol year, Adeyemi sat in his office and read the latest diplomatic update from the compact session. The update was 3 pages. He read it in 7 minutes. Put it down. Made tea. Okafor knocked. Sir, the compact's press division wants to know if you'll give a statement, for the formal record, about the engagement. About, he paused. finding the right words, about what it means. Adeyemi looked at his tea, looked out the window at Lagos, which was loud and bright and moving with the specific energy of a city that was the same city it had always been, and also something slightly different now, slightly proud in a way that didn't announce itself, the way an old building is proud just by still standing. "Tell them I'm flattered," he said. And I'm a military officer, not a philosopher. They can ask me about logistics. They can ask me about the defense network structure. They can ask me about supply chains." He picked up his tea. "For what it means, they should ask someone else." Okafor made a note. "Sir, the communication channel to the compact and the hegemony, the one we opened when we sent the reply. And what about it? We never closed it." Adeyemi looked at him. "We know," he said. Okafor waited. "Leave it open," Adeyemi said. He sat for a moment longer. "We leave every channel open," he said. "That's always been the policy." The channel stayed open. The hegemony's analysts flagged it in their systems as an anomaly, a species that maintained active communication channels, even after a conflict ended. Most species close channels after engagements. A psychological clean cut, a way of marking times that is over now. Earth's channel stayed warm and clear and alive as if nothing had happened and everything was fine and there was no reason in the world to close it. It took the hegemony's Cultural Analysis Division 2 years to write a report on what it meant. The report's conclusion was 4 paragraphs long and most of it was hedged and qualified in the way things are hedged and qualified when analysts are not quite sure what they're looking at. But the final paragraph was plain. The open channel is a message. The message is, we are still here. We were always going to still be here. We know you are listening and we have nothing to hide from you, and we will remain on this frequency for as long as you want to talk. The message is specifically addressed to the hegemony. It is not a threat. It is a statement about permanence. The species of Earth is telling us that it does not end, that this engagement is one page in a very long document, that whatever we decide to do next, they will be there when we decide it. The report was filed, read by the right people. On the Times Eternal Meridian, in his cabin, Khan read the cultural analysis summary. Read the last paragraph twice. Put it down. Looked out the viewport at the stars. He thought about 59 days. About 12 ships. About the question Earth had asked at the very beginning, before a single weapon was fired. How many of them knew they were going to lose? He thought about all 300. He thought about himself sitting here, reading a report about an open channel. He thought about the question in reverse. They had not known they were going to lose. No one had told them that they should expect to. No one had prepared them for something that treated loss as information and kept going. No one had thought to ask, in 600 years, what would happen when the calculation didn't work? He filed a response to the cultural analysis. Short, personal notation, not for distribution. Note for record, the question they asked us before the engagement. We assumed it was a challenge. It was a gift. They were telling us what they were. We chose not to hear it. He closed the file. Out in the Sol system, on the 3rd planet, in a city in West Africa, a man made his morning tea. Outside his window, the city was loud and alive. The sky above it was pale and clear. The channel was open. It was always open. It had never needed to be anything else.